Okay, here's one we're going to do on cowboys and kind of cowboys in general. Although, whenever I say that in a modern day, you might be thinking of a football team. And especially if you live in the Americas, you'll probably think of such. And if you live where I do in Texas, you're definitely thinking along those lines. But it's odd whenever it gets to Texas, really, we don't think about that. The Cowboys and that Lone Star represent something that's a heritage that goes back in this area from the founding of America itself. But the idea of a cowboy and something like a Conestoga wagon going west is nothing new, even in the Americas. Although we're going to discuss what people modern day think and know about cowboys and its heritage and how in the Wild West and everything like that, I want to make a clear distinction that these people, of course, come from a heritage of people who had domesticated these animals long before this point. In fact, the reason they were in America and this was going on was because of that. So how far does it go back? Well, sheriff has a posse and everything, but also a knight has his little group that goes out with him that makes things happen. So how long has things like that been going on? Well, it seems like well before recorded time. Just to put a time buster here on the situation, there's in Camyana Mohila, over in Proto-Indo-European lands, found at 22,000 BC, ancient scratch writing and things like that, which appear to mimic the Sumerians and so on like that. And they had already found charcoal and dated it at 22,000 BC. And then at the lower levels, as they took this part that had been silted in out, there's more pictures, and there's a mammoth there and so on. And there's a guy on a horse. And this is even at a lower level. But instantly it was ridiculed and backlashed on, and then they tried to say that the mammoth looking thing, which I've got a video about that, said that it was, no, that's got to be a cow then, trying to take 10,000 years off of it or more, to 15 perhaps, real quick, if it showed that horse over there and so on and everything else. And other people try to come up with the apologetic that that's just a person standing behind the horse. And you go, well, I see what you're trying to say, but since all these other cave drawings that are already verified, that lead from this time all the way on, that have that exact same look to it, are people riding horses, we're going to have to go with that looks like a guy on a horse, and it's already a documented layer of 22,000 BC. There's cows right over there in the pictographs that are done. And so how long had people perhaps been riding horses and chasing down cows that they're eventually going to domesticate? For you look at this scenario that's right here, this is an Old West type thing that people are real familiar with. But in the background over there on the left, you can see there's a group of people that are there, and then farther behind them is a group of cattle and all kinds of stuff and some more horsemen. Well, they've got a group of cows that are there, and this is one that got away from the herd, and they're lassoing and stuff. And what are they doing? Well, they might be branding them and so on like that people think of, but quite often this is actually the running of an ancient cattle trail, like some of the ones that came through Dallas itself and up into areas to feed everybody, like the Chisholm Trails and Goodnight Loving Trail, great name, and things like that people may or may not be really aware of, that used to happen, and say, oh, well, Cowboys goes way back to that. And it's like, well, actually, in reality, it goes way, way back. That Conestoga wagon idea and these wagon wheels that look, spoked going around and so on, that's exactly like the wheels that were found spoked 5,000 years ago and more in Proto-Indo-Europeans. In fact, they had huge wheels on things, and they would take their entire house and put it on that, and it was a yurt. And so they not only had a Conestoga wagon, they had a mobile home situation going on. They had horses and things too. But let's get back into the thing talking about it. For I have a few reasons myself to personally have gone through the endeavor of doing this video. One of which is my heritage. My father was extremely enamored with cowboys, with this Wild West time and things like that. He couldn't get enough of it. Any movies that were coming on, he'd look for them and things like that. No, you've seen that 10 times, Dad. That's more like 15, son, but I'm watching it again. I love it. You do the same thing to Star Wars. uh, Touche. Hey, it's like you couldn't really bitch about it. And it was one of the cool things. You didn't see him reading a whole lot of books, but if you ever saw him reading books, which I saw him read a lot of this type, it was generally Western books and Louis L'Amour books. In fact, he had the entire collection and so on. We used to get some of them for Christmas and so on, but pretty soon we ran out of it. Every possibility. Even shows and time life books and even books about Indians and ancient heritage and the wild, wild west books that came out and stuff. And they had, oh, what was it, Sam Elliott telling you that somewhere in these Chiricahua hills, no white man will ever know where lies Sitting Bull and all that type of stuff in those commercials, you remember? Even my earliest childhood memories of us doing family trips, some of which were to go to Mount Rushmore and to a whole bunch of Indian reservations and back through Dodge City, Kansas, and see this thing and museum and gunfighter deal and everything. And another trip we did was out through the Southwest and OK Corral and Tucson and all of these type of things. And again, Indian reservations and so on. When we lived in Omaha, Nebraska, there's a place called Exarban, which I found out later is actually Nebraska backwards, that's over here on the border, and we used to go to that whenever we were kids and everything too. In fact, my first time I ever saw something that's a rhinestone cowboy was this situation, for they had some guys and girls come out in a parade type situation in the middle of this deal, and asked my dad, what's this? And he goes, that's all part of it and heritage and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh, cool. They had like a whole halftime show. They had Indians come out and they were bouncing on off of horses while they were going around and doing stuff. They had a guy come out and do a tomahawk show from far away, and it was really into the split trunk of a tree, just like you think about in situations. Anyhow, that rhinestone cowboy came out, and it was way before they had Christmas lights that like you could hook up to a little thing like nowadays and have a glitter suit on. And they had lit up suits, and they made it to where this one certain time came up, they shut the lights down real dim, and only the outside lights were on over there, and you could see it. And it just came out solemnly and had a flag and everything, and people lost their minds. And I realized then that, man, people are just way into this, that this is a heritage that goes way back. So, that, and I tried to study about it because of things like that. And of course, I had always been enamored in horses since I was a little kid. One of the earliest things my mom ever told me was, when you were 4, you ran off. You were supposed to hang with your brother and sister, but they wouldn't let you play with them, and this, that, and the other. And next thing you know, you ran off 4 blocks away and across a kind of a highway there, and ended up in a horse pasture petting horses, and they were losing their minds trying to find me. But I always loved horses. I got to ride horses when I was a little bit older at my uncle's ranch we went out to. He had his own brand and everything, and but it was just a small little thing, not what you're probably thinking of now. But he had horses out there too, and we got to get on the back of them and everything and try to ride them. And these horses were so well trained and wanted this, and the camaraderie in the situation. They had this trough thing they knew they'd get up on to where we could get up on them, and he'd come over and get right up onto the thing, and you'd get up on the horse and ride him for a while. I fell off of one trying to go real fast and cut around a corner, and I slid off of him and hit the ground, and my elbow got caught up under me right whenever I hit, and it knocked the air out of me. I couldn't breathe. I remember I thought I was going to die. Oh, but just after that, I was back riding that horse again. You go over and you pet the horse, and he'd walk you right over, and he'd go, you want to ride? A lot of people think of nowadays it's like some type of animal cruelty and situation, rodeos and things like that, but not really. Some of the events like, bucko bronking and things like that, where you're actually breaking the horse, well, you're not actually breaking a horse. You're doing a show-off routine that's a little different than that. And a lot of people have gone against that. Even bull riding and all these situations go along with it. And in fact, this scenario you see here where they're heading and heeling this cow, what they're fixing to do is catch him and everything. You can see that on the side of him, they've already got him painted with the mark. Doesn't look like it's a brand or anything. The brand would probably be a smaller thing on his butt. But this diamond O drawn on his side, probably with paint. But if you look at the horses on their tails or on their butts, they have them too. This one has something that looks like an L, and this one has something that looks like Alpha and Omega, or perhaps a Taurid type symbol of a bull, and that kind of makes sense and go along with it. A lot of y'all know that I worked on a ranch for a while. Yeah, so I have some firsthand knowledge of this, but also more maybe from family and heritage and looking all into it and things like that, and hell, living in Texas a little bit and, being on top of it, but having looked into it. I've even been in a scenario exactly like this. Had a very important thing, but instead of it being a dried up adventure, it was raining and about to flood and a problem. Maybe I'll tell you about that here later, for this is probably going to go into a multi-parter. There's multiple reasons for me to do this, though, other than that and my heritage. I know I come to find out the kid bedstead and headboard and everything that I grew up with, that's a wagon wheel. In fact, it was made all out of a wagon thing. Just like a wagon wheel going around and everything else. It was a little later I realized, all my furniture was that way, and my dad kind of set it up that way. Hey, but even that chair, the posts that go to the back of it and the legs that went to it, those are just the posts and legs that go around the spokes of a wheel. In fact, that arching back it's got on it is a portion of the wheel. In fact, the other chair I don't have in my room that we have up in the attic has the rounded bottom on it, and it's the same thing but made as a grandpa or a rocking chair, and it literally is the bottom part not being flat, but it's the portion of the wheel attached to the bottom of what? Yeah, in fact, you could leave that attached to part of it and make the things. That's amazing. You can just take a wagon wheel and take things apart. I've talked before about how a lot of Viking longhouses are really made out of boats. They even found the Mayflower, and it's a barn. A lot of these giant old galleons and boats and things like that, they're barns now and things. Yeah. Symbology you can still see in Scandinavian lands and Nordic lands, where the awnings of the front of the house is actually part of that boat and everything, and it gives you that same symbology. But it goes way back in reality before I go into this cowboy thing, for I study ancient cultures and everything, and this idea of culture and domesticating cows is way older than we actually even gave credit for, even just recently. And horses the same way somewhat. Not to everybody, but to a certain people. And those certain people, one seemed to have done the cattle more than the horses, for when the cattle got drawn down into the Middle Eastern area that we know of and into Egypt, about 7,000 BC or so, or a little after, depending on where we're talking about, they brought this, along with a lot of other knowledge that goes along with it. But they didn't bring horses. If you look into it, that comes much later. Whenever they come with chariots. They come with a better bow. They come with horses. And at that time, when people are only riding donkey and having oxes, it's quite a different endeavor. It's like somebody having horses and somebody showing up in a Jeep. Not only can I go much faster than you, but check this crap out. And they can shoot at you while they're going. But heading and heeling, and I used to work on this ranch, so I'll get into that a little bit later, but we used to have a guy that knew real good about this. In fact, you talk about ancient belt buckles of cowboys, that's one of the symbols, of course, the boots, the hat, so on. But people used to wear hats that are a little different shape than this right now, but this same situation with ropes made out of hemp and so on went way back. We had a guy, though, that was working at that ranch that was a champion of rodeo as far as heeling goes, and so it came in handy a few times. We had another guy that was a champion bull rider, had the belt buckle from winning it and everything. Mesquite Rodeo. It's not too far from my house here. Then we had another guy that was a champion bronc rider, bareback. Yeah, and so he could break the hell out of some horses. But he didn't make it look like a bronco show whenever he did it. Although we had one horse that gave him trouble, and it kind of looked that way. Tried to throw him a bunch of times and then just laid down on him, pissed him off. Tried to hurt him. So let's just get into this here a little bit. For one of the other reasons might be alternatively shown here a little bit later. For I said that one day I'd probably do this, but I just put it on the back burner, really. But I wanted to do something about it, but I felt like something's got to come up, that sets it off and everything, whatever. And then I had a guy come show me up that one of these debunker guys is trying to claim that they were the first Cowboys and all this other stuff. And we'll get into that a little bit. It'll just do itself here. So let's go off this picture here. And if you look up ranch hand, it redirects here. For other uses, see Cowboy disambiguation. In other words, there's disambiguation about, it can be used as a bad connotation in some way. Well, sure, outlaws and things like that, loners, rebels, blah. Ranch hand, too. And of course, that could be looked at as being somewhat of a disambiguation somehow, too, that you're not some big guy, that you're a ranch hand. But if you've ever been part of a ranch, it's a well-oiled machine kind of that works together with everybody, and they all got to be wanting to do it and make it all happen, and it makes it happen. It can be very fruitious, too. The one I worked on had a huge peach orchard with a little bit of pear and apples, too, on orchard onto it, too. They had turkey traps to catch turkeys onto them. Had great ponds of fish and everything, too. That was great. We had a bunch of horses, too, and I got to be a part of that. We'll talk about that here in a minute. And also, we raised cattle, but the main thing that we're doing was hay to feed all the cattle. We grew corn and a bunch of other stuff, but of course it was on a small scale that ended up supporting a couple of roadside stand situations. Other than that, it wasn't like we were supporting the local grocery or anything, but we were easily supporting ourselves with most everything. And then from the massive sales that the rest of the part came out of, we were able to buy anything else that we wanted. Yeah, and steaks was not a question if you wanted it. You'd get so tired of steaks, you'd try to get chicken. Well, we raised some chickens too. Yeah. Even raised geese, but when it came around to it for a Christmas goose, nobody wanted to do it. Anyhow, a cowboy's an animal herder who tends cattle or ranches in North America. Or that's our current tradition, because traditionally he's on horseback and often performs a multitude of other ranch-related tasks. The historic American cowboy of the late 19th century arose from the vaquero traditions of northern Mexico and becomes a figure of special significance and legend. We have a lot of legends, and of course the movies that we've put out have put a lot about that and everything too, but there are true legends of the Old West. In fact, I swear one of my books I got over there after my dad passed is True Legends of the Old West. And there's a lot of them about gunfighters and things like that, and then all the hype that was about gunfighters and what had actually happened, and then how sometimes they played it down and how it was really incredible in other situations. Anyhow, so a subtype called a wrangler specifically tends horses used to work cattle. So this is a multi-part thing here. In addition to work, some cowboys worked or participated in rodeos. Cowgirls, first defined such in the 19th century, had a less well-documented historical role, but in modern world had identical tasks and have obtained considerable respect for their achievements too. Cattle handlers in many other parts of the world, particularly South America and Australia, perform similar work to the cowboy. Well, this goes on through all kinds of things. And hey, I got a cowboy hat. I got some boots that you'd call cowboy boots. They're not just all wrinkled out, but they're like cowboy boots, if you will, for if you need to. And they're tall enough if I could walk around an area that I thought had snakes in it, I wouldn't feel like I was worrying about it also. And I've got a pair of Brogan type boots too that work good for that too. But I also have a couple of cowboy hats. Well, one of them kind of even looks Indiana Jonesy cowboy, yeah. And then one's a cowboy hat. And then one of them is actually a wicker made one that's Chichi Rodriguez, the golfer, but it's like what you maybe have seen Greg Norman always had, and I'll be damned if that's the cowboy hat. Yeah, didn't wear them all the time, but it's weird, but once I started wearing glasses, and that was such a distraction while I was playing and stuff, it wasn't so bad to wear a hat. But of course, whenever I was younger and everything, it didn't matter that I was squinting a little bit more. But let's just go on. Cowboy has deep historic roots tracing back to Spain and the earliest European settlers of the Americas. What? Well, the Spaniards came over, and yet everything people know that whenever they left, that left a bunch of roaming horses that ended up being the Mustangs, right? Yeah. A lot of people don't realize that they owned a good portion of southern, southeastern Americas, if you will, and then the France and the Louisiana Purchase and everything. Is anybody? So they had that. Somebody's made the claim, although I think that it can't be verified, that the third ship over, not the Mayflower and the things, not the Nina Pinta, Santa Marina, and so on, but the third set of ships that came over had horses with them, although it was only like three, and one of them died shortly after, but the other two went on, and of course that's a male and a female, and that led to go on to be the da-da-da of these Virginia running horses and Morgans, to their lineage that, all, other than that point, possibly got lost out. But it can't be totally verified. Anyhow, over the centuries, differences in terrain and climate and the influence of cattle handling traditions from multiple cultures created several distinct types and styles of equipment, clothing, and animal handling. As the ever practical cowboy adapted to the modern world, his equipment and techniques also adapted through many classic traditions are preserved, though many classical traditions are preserved. And we can still see that today, especially in something like country music. Although country music nowadays would have actually been the rock and roll of your grandparents in the 50s and so on. And, you know, at 1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock rock, if it just had a fiddle in the thing and a little bit less of an upbeat, more of the offbeat style, there it is. And so it's really kind of rock and roll, but yet it still retains a lot of that slow ballads. But ironically, rock and roll, some of its most famous songs are, again, ballad type situations that aren't too much different from this. In fact, whenever I grew up, there was Bon Jovi and their Cowboy, Dead or Alive type song that kind of heralded through there. It seemed like there was a trend right in there too that was another moment to be proud of Cowboys, not just the football team that was doing so well, but the actual heritage of itself, at least in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that I can notice. But there was a lot of people too. Maybe what spurned it was urban cowboy and all that stuff, and everybody wanted to put a pinch between their cheek and gum and pull off a cowboy or some urban cowboy look. Anyhow, so etymology and mainstream usage. The English word cowboy has an origin from several earlier terms that referred to both age and to cattle or cattle tending work. It's basically like putting something with like young men and cattle. Yeah, it's like horseman. Yeah, like centaur, but we won't go there. The English word cowboy was derived from vaquero, a Spanish word for an individual who managed cattle while mounted on horseback. Vaquero was derived from vaca, and this means cow, which came from the Latin word vaca. Cowboy was first used in print by Jonathan Swift in 1725, referring to a boy that was tending cows. It was used in Britain from 1820 to 1850 to describe young boys who tended the family or community cows. Originally, though, the English word cow herd was used to describe a cattle herder, simple to shepherd, which was sheep herder, and often referred to a pre-adolescent or early adolescent boy whose usual work on foot. This word is a very old English language originating prior to the year 1000. So that concept goes back to there, but make no discrepancy about it. It definitely has roots that go back before this, whenever you know in reality, of course, that they had horses well before then, and it was the young men that were helping to tend them to become familiar, to do all the things they had to do to become horsemen and cowboys. Well, they tend the cows. Well, they can tend it on the horses also. But a cowboy is a horseman. Isn't that weird? Not really when you put it together. By 1849, Cowboy had developed its modern sense as an adult cattle handler of the American West. Variations of the word appeared later, and cowhand appeared in 1852 and cowpoke in 1881, originally restricted to the individuals who prodded cattle with long poles to load them onto railroad cars for shipping. Well, there was also shepherds that used to have poles that would go around and try to keep them corralled. That's where that concept comes from, into an area. Usually they'd find a natural place, like a ravine that had a little escarpment to it, or a little cliffish area there, and then that would be a natural border, and they would put them in that area and tend their flocks by night, make sure nothing happens. There's a dog out there, and they ended up breeding that dog to look kind of like the sheep, so the wolves don't really notice. So if he comes in there messing, whoa, 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 it's on. So cowpoke can go way back from there, and people say cowpoke has to do with branding too. I think it mentions it again. Names for a cowboy in ancient English include buckaroo, cowpoke, cowhand, and cowpuncher. An English word for cowboy, buckaroo, is an anglicized version of buckaroo. Today, cowboy is a term oftenly throughout the West, and particularly the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. Buckaroo are primarily in the Great Basin of California, you hear, and cowpuncher mostly in Texas and Texas states. Well, that makes sense whenever you figure out the old cattle trails used to come here through Texas, and it was the major outpost and leading out through, and all the ancient cattle trails, and they might have been the ones that cowpoked them onto little places and doing things like that. Just makes sense. People that were breaking horses were buckaroos hooked up with equestrian people. Equestrianism required skills. Equestrianism required skills and an investment in the horses and equipment rarely available or entrusted to a child, though in some cultures boys rode a donkey while going to and from pasture. And of course in the Middle East, before horses really got there, that all happened. Later there's the Arabian horses and so on like that. In antiquity, herding of sheep, cattle, and goats was often the job of miners, though, and still is a task for young people in various third world countries today. Oh, there are kids that are still working on farms to this day that they're omitting, that get up before the sun and gets their certain things knocked out. So everything goes good with the chickens and pigs and the things that go on. So when after school, everything's still going on fine, and you only have to do those chores to finish off before dinner and so on. And it's a way of life that pretty much is fading a little bit with modernism, but in very rural communities it's still quite much there. Some people try to think that they're backwards because they're not all caught up in the rat race. Because of the time and physical ability needed to develop necessary skills, both historic and modern cowboys often began as an adolescent. Historically, cowboys earned wages as soon as they developed sufficient skill to be hired, often as young as 10, 12, 13 years old. They say 12 or 13, but it's well documented. Some kids around 10 years old able to do some things. Well, why? Well, they were already working with the cows all the way through growing up and all this stuff. So they're able to do something like that. If not crippled by injury, cowboys may handle cattle or horses for the lifetime. In the United States, a few women also took to the task of ranching and learned the necessary skills for the cowgirl. Discussed below, did the United States not becoming widely recognized or acknowledged until the close of the 19th century, though. On Western ranches today, the working cowboy is usually an adult. Responsibility for herding cattle or other livestock is no longer considered suitable for children or early adolescents. However, both boys and girls growing up on ranch environments often learn to ride horses and perform basic ranch skills as soon as they are physically able. Till to this day, usually under adult supervision, such youths by their late teens are often given responsibilities for cowboy work on the ranch. And so we're at that same situation. Nothing's really changed in that. In fact, the only thing that takes away from that is all of the modernness that can be utilized. Right? Other historic word uses, though. Cowboy was used during the American Revolution to describe American fighters who opposed the movement for independence. Yep, they actually used it as people that were like in the Redcoats. Check it out. Claudia Smith, an outlaw identified with the Loyalist cause, was called the Cowboy of Ramaposa due to his penchant for stealing oxen, cattle, and horses from colonists and giving them back to the British, or giving them away to the British. What? Yeah, this is kind of a, Robin Hood meets doing this. But of course, this is before the Revolution thing, so you could think something like this might be acceptable, except for we're seceding, so in a modern afterpoint, not. Right? In the same period, a number of guerrilla bands operated in Westchester County, which marks the dividing line between the British and American forces. These groups were made up of local farmhands who would ambush convoys and carry out raids on both sides. They were called highwaymen and stuff like this. And of course, highwaymen goes back to Europe and people that used to do the same thing. It's like the brigands and highwaymen of old. And how long did that go on? Oh, a long way. In the ancient Silk Road? Oh, yeah, it happened down there. You had to have protection going through things like this because people were just set up for it. You were either coming with a bunch of money or a bunch of goods or leaving with it. Protection. There were two separate groups of these guys they're talking about here in the modern time, though, or near modern time. Skinners fought for the pre-independence side, pro-independence, while the Cowboys supported the British. What? Yeah, so, but that's only because of that guy putting the connotation on that guy that was a traitor to their cause. Why? Well, because he compared him to outlaws. No, he didn't. He compared it to cowboys. Yeah, he used the wrong lingo. Whatever. In Tombstone, Arizona, during the 1880s, the term cowboy or cowboy was used pejoratively to describe men who had been implicated in various crimes. One loosely organized band was dubbed the Cowboys and profited from smuggling cattle, so these guys were cattle wranglers, alcohol, and tobacco across the U.S.-Mexico border. Oh, so they were banditos. No, they're going to call them cowboys. No, these guys over here raising cattle for a living or you try to get a bad name put on it. Didn't really work out over long term, but there's still some flavor there. And even modern day people think of like farmers and ranchers as being somewhat backwards, as I talked about. The San Francisco Examiner wrote in editorial, "Cowboys are the most reckless class of outlaws in the wild country, infinitely worse than the ordinary robber." It became an insult in the area to call someone a cowboy, as it suggested he was a horse thief, robber, or an outlaw. Cattlemen were generally called herders and ranchers, and not cowboys because of that, of course. The cowboys' activities were ultimately curtailed by the gunfight at the OK Corral and the resulting Earp vendetta raids. Yeah, it's amazing how sometimes just one event ended up setting a standard that wasn't going to be allowed anymore and so on. But yeah, people weren't. And so whenever you even see movies about that, sometimes people are somewhat confused whenever they go, "How's this all work out?" Well, they kind of try to explain it in one of those more modern versions they had come out. But other times they want to make it more grandiose and so on out of it. But yeah, you like something that can be a little more natural and true than something like some Clint Eastwood thing. I'll be your Huckleberry. Spanish roots. So they mention various aspects of the Spanish equestrian tradition can be traced back to Islamic rule in Spain. What's that? Well, that's the Moors. The Islamic rule in Spain. The Moors were Caucasians. They were part of Islam too. They had gotten horses and they came across. This is North Africa here, and then into Spain. Across the little Strait of Gibraltar right there. Yeah, so the Moors were, of course, Caucasians too, but Elements such as the use of Oriental type horses. What's an Oriental type horse here? Are you going to put that on there? So this is a breed where they say, but they say Oriental. So Oriental is just more Eastern. That's what the word means. But Arabian, Alcalteque, Barb, and now the extinct Tucumán horse tend to be thin-skinned, long legs, slim build, and more physically refined than other types. Well, yeah, there's an Andalusian type horse too that comes from out of that lineage of Arabian horses and so on. If you ever seen an Arabian horse or road horses, like a quarter horse and an Arabian, they look real slender. They definitely got a greyhound thing going on a little bit, but then there are thoroughbred situations going on too. It's a wide variety over time that these Caucasians, with their domestication capabilities, are able to change these animals into quite different creatures. Pack animals so strong it's like a giant Clydesdale, but then other things are like a Welsh pony that kids can hop on, and Shetland ponies. So extreme wide variety. The origins of the cowboy tradition come from Spain. Beginning in the hacienda system of medieval Spain, the style of cattle ranching spread throughout much of the Iberian Peninsula and later was imported to the Americas. Both regions possessed a dry climate with sparse grass and herded large cattle in vast amounts of land to obtain sufficient forage. That's the reason they did the spaghetti westerns back over in Spain. It's because, yeah, it kind of has that same look like it. Yeah. Doodaloo, wah, wah, wah. The need to cover distances greater than a person on foot could manage gave rise to the development of the horseback mounted vaquero. I would say that it wasn't cattle getting out of hand for shepherds and then they finally hopped on a horse. I would say that's the way it went on with that group that were there, but there were other shepherds or horsemen, and that worked in conjunctive long before that. It's just when these people were able to attain horses and use them in that situation. It's a little bit different of a statement, but okay. Spanish roots. Various aspects of Spanish equestrian tradition can be traced back to the Islamic rule in Spain, including Moorish elements such as the use of Oriental horses, la llanera riding style, characterized by a shorter stirrup, solid treed saddle, and the use of spurs. You know, spurs are the little hooks, which if you look at this picture here, or I'll do that, here on the back of that, and it's made to flank the horse in the back. Now, people that use modern bronco busting will use some spurs. They're not near as sharp or anything like this, and they rake them across their body here, and because they're leaned back and doing so on. You can see the saddle's a little more of a saddle and really carries somebody and doesn't let them fall out real easy. While this style has a pommel onto it, so you're able to use ropes and things like that in that nature. And other versions, they don't have that, and it's people that weren't really using ropes. And again, you see that he doesn't have the other accoutrements, and it looks like his one-shot gun's kept here, and what he constantly keeps out is something that we would recognize as a lance or a spear. The heavy noseband or hackamore, so you look at a hackamore bit, and what it is it doesn't have the bit that's in his mouth. It, by pulling on it, it contorts and squeezes on their nose. I've used these before. I had horses that are so well trained and stuff like that, you really didn't have to have much anything on them. Maybe I'll tell a story in a minute about one. But a lot of times they'll have a buckle that's attached here and goes around the chin and the other side. Otherwise, they can just throw this thing right off their ears fairly easy. So Arabic sakima and Spanish yakima are the same thing, and that works together from ancient Persia, which the Aryans. Yeah, they even Darius calls himself such, but that's not what this video is about. We're talking about horses, right? Well, sometimes they work synonymously together. Other horse-related equipment and technologies come out of that. Certain aspects of the Arabian tradition, such as the hackamore, can in turn be traced as roots back in ancient Persia. And there we have ancient Persia and its symbology that looked a little bit Egyptian, but mainly Sumerian, huh? During the 16th century, the conquistadors and other Spanish settlers brought their cattle-raising traditions as well as both horses and domesticated cattle to the Americas, starting with their arrival into what is today Mexico and Florida. The traditions of Spain were transformed by the geographic environment and cultural circumstances of this new Spain. See if they'll show you where on the map it is so everybody can see it. No. Um, but which later became Mexico and the southwestern United States. In turn, the land and people of the Americas also saw dramatic changes due to Spanish influence. Well, you would see that mainly in South America, but as you get closer and closer, and then, I have a lot of Mexicans around me here, of course, living in Texas. And I have that in California also, anywhere that there's a border. But of course, that border is being slowed down now, and well, we don't want to get into that. But you can sure see Spanish influence in that. But in the whole lifestyle of everybody that's there, you can see it. The arrival of horses was particularly significant as equines had been extinct in the Americas since the end of the prehistoric ice age. We had something like a horse here. Well, they were smaller and stuff, but they all got killed off at the end of the Younger Dryas event and stuff, along with camels that used to be here, and lions and saber-toothed tigers and all of these giant tapirs, and just a myriad of creatures that I've done videos about and stuff. And along with the story that goes along with that, the horses come back. There were some people that were saying, well, some of those that were found in the Rocky Mountains and everything, they may have been hybrids for some that was still here before, that may have been a lost remnant that was still there, and somehow Mustangs might have come from that. Other people say nah, and I think whenever you look at it genetically wise, they've been able to realize no. However, these horses quickly multiplied in America and became crucial to the success of the Spanish and later settlers from other nations. The earliest horses were originally Andalusian, Barb, and Arabian ancestry. Let's see if Andalusian will show a horse. Yeah, it does show an Andalusian horse. They're beautiful. It's like Black Beauty was an Andalusian type horse. But a number of uniquely American horse breeds developed in the North and South America through selective breeding and by natural selection of animals that escaped in the wild together formed different breeds. The Mustang and other colonial horse breeds are now called wild, but in reality are feral horses, which are just escaped descendants of domesticated animals, if you will. Much like if you saw cats running around and you knew they weren't attached to a house. Feral animals. A lot of other feral animals that are around, and certain ones cause a lot of problem to local places, and some of them have been introduced accidentally or not in places to cause one remedy and have caused another. But these are all feral and descendants of domesticated animals that had already genetically been messed with. They're not anything back to a wild horse now. You can't really find that too much. In fact, the closest thing to a wild, undeviated horse is the ones that we find that are kind of like the Welsh horses, where they're a little small and squattyish looking, and they look a little rugged and blotchy a little bit, but or they're just a buckskin type color, and they're mainly in Mongol area and stuff like that, and people know that's got to be like some of them were, because even some of the ancient Cro-Magnon cave art and things like that actually shows you ones that look exactly like that. Whereas the modern horse is something that's a little bit different. Though properly considered American, and the traditional cowboy began with a Spanish tradition. Well, I would say it goes from that, and it goes, of course, they said it goes from Persia and then da-da-da, but also we find that the other part of it comes through. Of course, all the Crusaders and guys had horses, but when did they have horses? Oh, thousands of years before that, and it goes back, and then they, of course, used to be Proto-Indo-Europeans that came in and everything, and they had the horses and everything, and then they had it going on. So where does it go back to? Oh, we're going to go to 22,000 BC on a cave wall, but an accepted date of at least 8,600. But then people look at the genetics of the horse there, and they go, people were doing there was something going on genetically, just like the grains. Long, long ago, people bitch about we've messed with the corn and things like that.